Yeah, and thanks. My name's Jeff. I do want to share ideas that have been coming toward me. I really love the Passion Grant, right? And I just really think that's a pretty concise and effective and accurate depiction of Marx's ideas. And I do recall when I had that kind of passion and that kind of commitment to such ideals. And I was changed a little bit. I have been moving around the political spectrum. I did consider myself a radical, far left, looking for a revolution and trying desperately to make such things happen. And it is kind of odd. It was kind of changed a bit from an unusual source that I didn't expect. I happened to buy a house. Well, my wife actually bought the house next to an old grist mill, a business that had been in existence since 1648, which served the local agricultural community, and a bunch of uneducated, redneck farmers started getting me to think about things in a new way, and really made me see things that looks at the way, and I can't really move, right?
It's you stay in that frame of space, you're great.
Okay, I'll do my best. There's these extreme positions, and really Marx had to be rather simple. And I don't want to impugn anything that you said, because there is much truth in this Marxian perspective. Marx had many insights that were extremely valuable, and many people were critiquing the system as Marx was at the time, but really he was able to capture a simple formula that made sense, that therefore lasted, because it really was articulate and not real complicated. His motive was to inspire revolution, and to do so, he wanted to talk to the people, the intelligentsia. He wanted to get the elites of society. He wasn't able, though, to rouse enough concern or anger in the system from many of those groups that really had enough power to make revolution. So he therefore turned to the working class. The working class did have numbers, and they also had motivation because the system was not working in their favor. But at the same time, in order to do so, he had to make his plan rather simplistic. And the thing about Marxian critique and the alternative, the capitalist rampage that's now trying to destroy our world, those extremes are powerful because they have a very clear and concise message. And I would like to argue that somewhere in between those extremes is probably more accurate if we're really going to find a solution to the problems that we find inherent in what we have right now as a capitalist system. And talking about free trade, I want to just jump into that immediately. And a Marxian analysis is really accurate when you start thinking about where profit comes from and looking at labor as the essential creator of wealth. And obviously, if we can find labor costs that will produce a product at pennies on the dollar, we can go to China. And the Chinese workers, as they did in Japan, began to become frustrated and agitated for higher wages, higher standards of living. Production facilities moved to the cheaper country. And then we're now seeing our goods and services, well, primarily our goods, our manufactured goods being produced in cheaper and cheaper places. Capital, as it's become more global, is searching the world for the cheapest possible source of labor costs. We also have other production costs like pollution, the needs of getting rid of our toxins and the byproducts. We've got a whole series of other costs that go along with that, taxes. We could continue on down the line. So it's not simply labor, but production costs. But there are many other things as well that big money is earning greater wealth through. And it does not just come from producing things at the point of production at a cheaper cost, but actually, when you start searching the world for places where the standard of living is low, and where the cost of living is low, where wages are low, of course, what ends up happening is the traders on a global scale can then find places where that cost is low enough so that the values then, the costs of goods to be sold in places like the United States are going to undermine those that are producing goods here. Our workers have to live in a society where a house costs a couple $100,000. They have to live in a society where a car is going to cost $20,000. A cheap car, 12, an expensive car, 40, whatever. The cost of living is high here. Therefore, it costs a lot. We need to have higher wages, just simply to survive at a decent standard of living. So it is to the producers' advantage, not just the industrialists, but those large investment bankers, to find places where they can manipulate currencies. So where they can manipulate the differential between the cost of living, wages, and things like that. So we're being manipulated. We're being played off of each other. But there are other things as well. The values of currencies float up and down on a global market, and therefore the global traders are able to manipulate currency prices. The large money makers in this country, and in the world, let's just say, actually, make more money off of manipulating currency than they do actually by producing goods at a cheaper price through labor at a low cost. We've got these, we can see it right now after this enormous bank bailout, now that the Fed has lowered their interest rates down to zero practically, that now those big investment banks are able to borrow money at zero interest, and then they can use that money at playing it off, buying currencies in other countries, and they're actually able to, through their connections and ownerships with other industries, able to manipulate economies so that currencies will rise and fall, and money is simply manufactured like magic. That's really where we're coming from in this economy. When you think about where wealth is generated, is really the basis of this. And this whole notion of free trade really grew out of looking at production costs, looking at lower wages and things, but that's just the surface. If we get to this point where the owners of the means of production, the owners of industries, and of course, the bankers who actually are in the business of selling money and making money off of money, we're creating wealth. They're creating wealth. We're actually paying the interest on that wealth. What they're able to do then is they're able to actually manipulate who has jobs, where those jobs are, how much those people are being paid, and they can actually fluctuate the value of an economy, whether or not an economy is going to grow or shrink, and therefore as currencies fluctuate, they're able to move their money from country to country just to take advantage of those shifting differences in the values of currency. The real money that's made in this world is not really made according to this old idea that we build a product using labor, and then the value of that product is enhanced because of the labor that went into it. The old labor theory of value with, we've got necessary labor time and then surplus labor time, and the greater the surplus labor time, the more money we're going to make. I mean, that is accurate, that is true. At the same time, though, that's not the real money that's being manufactured. The real wealth that's being created is actually taking place from people manipulating currencies and loaning money and charging compound interest. There's a really good reason that for hundreds of years in Europe, during those Middle Ages, interest was illegal. There's a pretty good reason for those that read the Bible, that the Bible actually says that interest is evil. Usury laws in this country existed, where compound interest was, we never went down to actually making it completely illegal, but the rates had to be very low. And I'm talking about way back in the dark ages of 1970s. Those things all went by the wayside after the Reagan Revolution, which all Marxists and myself seem to agree was the downfall of humanity. And that's kind of a joke, but only kind of. Well, I really do have a bit of a realization that Marx had to be simplistic, but this Marxian notion actually plays into the hands of the capitalists. We now have these extreme positions, the capitalist notions based upon our understanding of wealth generation, and the Marxian critique creates this alternative in which things like supply and demand are now the enemy, because it has looked at the way that big capital has manipulated our world to the point where it really has been taken to an extreme. The state really is in the control of big capital. Big money, big banking industries, the industrialists have been able to create a corporation through their connections in the court systems that takes a corporation that at one time was forced to serve the interests of society and had a very short lifespan, perhaps 40 years. The charter then had to go back up for the public to allow to continue. And if the corporation could not prove that it was working in the best interests of humanity, of society, then it would not be given its charter once again. We see the extreme conditions that have been allowed to unfold once we've got vast advantages of wealth and power in the hands of the few. So what I would like to present is some insights that those redneck hick farmers were telling me, and it is really quite interesting. This whole idea that Marx had was brilliant, that it takes labor to increase value. We start with raw materials, and we put our labor into the raw materials, and we create something of even greater value, which we can then sell for a profit. We can sell for more money than it cost us for the raw materials plus the labor. That is a wonderful insight. But where did those raw materials come from to begin with? Marx kind of was missing the origin of raw materials. All wealth has to come from the earth somewhere. It comes from the raw materials. It comes from logging, it comes from mining, it comes from fishing, and it comes from farming. Those things that extract raw materials from the earth. The majority of those, perhaps 3/4 of those raw materials and the wealth that can come from that, actually comes from agriculture. Like I said, this is a biased presentation because those darn farmers were thinking of their own concerns, but they had some incredible insights. They were showing me that you can start with a kernel of corn. You plant the kernel of corn in the ground, and then miraculously, in a few months' time, a matter of several weeks, you have hundreds of kernels of corn on an ear, and you've got several ears of corn on a stalk. You have taken one little bit of organic matter and created thousands of bits of organic matter for every plant that grows. We can take a cow and put grass in front of its face, and like a miracle, milk comes out the other end. Agriculture is able to produce wealth from virtually nothing. That's how we generate wealth. Wealth has to come from those raw materials. The raw materials are created, and then they're able to be processed. They're able to be manipulated through labor. But it all starts with the production of the raw materials. It starts with the farmer. The farmers are able to make, if they're able to make a livable wage, if they're able to make enough money so that they can meet their needs, plus put a little bit aside for a rainy day or for when the machinery breaks down or whatever, what they then are able to do is take their money and invest it in other products that they need in order to do their business. Their money then becomes the source of the next stage, where their raw materials are turned into finished products. Those finished products are then made into their finished products. They're processed by people who are then paid a livable wage. If they're paid a livable wage, they have enough to meet all their needs, to keep themselves content, plus put a little savings away in case of a rainy day, in case something bad happens. They've got the money to make sure that they don't fall into despair, blah, blah, blah. Those people need to live as well. They need the things that they need in order to sustain themselves, to maintain their standard of living. So they're buying other manufactured and processed goods from other people. And what we found when we look at, I'm actually referencing a number of people, but put together in Charles Walter's Unforgiven, among other publications, that agriculture as the starting point, bringing raw materials into the system, creating wealth, that are selling those products, and it takes 5 to 7 times that money goes through our economy. It is really fascinating to look throughout the entire 20th century that our gross domestic product is 7 times the amount of money that we pay our farmers, which is kind of staggering when you stop to think about it. It's quite simple, though. And those values hold up through the 1950s. Things did happen in the 1950s, though, that changed. And throughout our history in the United States, every time we have done things to manipulate that equation between the farmers and those that are actually processing the raw materials, that entrance into our economy with wealth, if we lower the rate at which they are paid, then there is less money in the system. There's less money that those people pay in order to purchase finished products. Therefore, the money that's bought and used to buy those finished products are used to then further growth of the businesses that produce those products, etc. Every time we've done anything to manipulate or lower that entrance wage, we have resulted in a recession. And I'll get to why in just a little bit. Now, Adam Smith, as it turns out, I really did think he was a bit of a evil man, all those kinds of things for developing the system of capitalism. But I've come to some realizations. Adam Smith was, a product of his environment. Adam Smith never lived in capitalism. He never lived under a capitalist system. The system of mercantilism that was talked about before is all that Adam Smith ever knew. But he theorized. He thought, wow, what would happen if we had a different system where we allowed people's greed and self-interest to motivate them to invest into things that they thought would help them. Once they were always looking out for their economic interests, which ironically our economists think is rational, but it is rather unfortunate because greed is never any good. And I'll have to come back to that as well, because we do require a community where we are compassionate and concerned about our neighbors and our fellow citizens. But Adam Smith created a theoretical, imagined idea of a more efficient way to do business than that mercantile system. But he was also extremely simplistic. He didn't realize what would happen once we became a global society, and once the corporate sector was able to transform from a small entity that had a limited life and that was mandated by law to serve the interests of society to one that the courts granted the rights of an individual and an unlimited lifespan and no concern whatsoever for anything other than its own profits. I mean, those are the really negative, nasty, extreme end results that Marx was observing in his time and that we're seeing in even a more extreme case right now. But when Adam Smith was thinking, he never imagined anything other than a small-scale, local economy using traditional methods that he was familiar, or with which he was familiar, if there's any English professors in the crowd. The notions of supply and demand really are based upon these basic, simplistic understandings. But really, that's what we had in this country at its origins, which is really what allowed democracy to flourish. That's what allowed economic growth to really take place as it did. We have local production. We have small-scale production, where the owner of the business, an entrepreneur, knows its laborers personally, because like I say, it's small scale. There's not so many people that the actual owner of the business doesn't know the people that are working underneath her or him. We had a competitive environment, but it was one that was actually controlled within the framework of a small-scale economy. Once our economy throughout the 19th century started to allow various groups, various businesses to become large enough to amass enormous amounts of wealth, which gave them a disproportionate advantage in the economic system, then all of a sudden we started to see enormous corporations, enormous businesses that were able to control the market, were able to undermine and eliminate competition. Our government stepped in rather quickly at the turn of the 20th century to eliminate monopolies. They never did eliminate them, but they sure did make a dent in them. They created this environment that monopolies were illegal, were impossible. Unfortunately, they didn't quite go far enough, because what we really did need was a competitive, dynamic system. If we allow the system to maintain small-scale production, where we don't allow anybody to get so big that they can control the market, then we could allow for a system that does operate efficiently with small individuals competing, but we can never forget that we also need an ethic, which is traditionally a part of Western tradition. Our Christian values do actually tell us, contrary to our capitalist ideologies that were pretty eloquently expressed, that we should look out for number one, that we shouldn't worry about others, only look out for ourselves and step on other people in order to advance our own interests. But if we really did have a Christian society that was compassionate and concerned for others, we could actually compete, but at the same time not allow our own self-interest to undermine the interests of our neighbors. And I actually did see that in the local agricultural community that my business served, which was a farm supply store in the Hudson Valley of New York. I thought all New Yorkers were greedy and rude and selfish and nasty people until I, by chance, moved into this business that was next door, and I ended up buying it with my wife. When we ran it, we were exposed to an entire community. And even though these dairy farmers, who were primarily those that I served, even though they were competing with each other, and even though they were all going to be selling on the same market, and they were trying to advance their own interests, when one of those farmers did have a crisis, they would all support each other. When one person's cows got out, everybody would help them get their cows back. Once, when the farmer that I actually worked for quite a while, because I had to learn what a farm store was all about. So I worked on a farm to figure out what I was selling. He had a case of lightning, let's just say, or spontaneous combustion, where his farm burned down once he became so far in debt that he couldn't get out from under it. The other competitors around took his cows on and milked them. They went out of their way to milk those cows. They were taking care of this guy, even though he was, in essence, the competition. So there is this sense of community in a traditional, rural, agricultural society that once thrived in the United States and still thrive here in Utah just a generation ago. It wasn't that long ago. So what we really do need is corporations that are going to serve local. I do have a point. I've got to get to that rather quickly. Let me just backtrack. Adam Smith theorized that capitalism would work under a system that was local, that was small scale, that was competitive. If you eliminate competition, if you allow the scale of any of these businesses to get so large that they have an unfair competitive advantage, it undermines the very theoretical foundation for capitalism. So capitalism in a free market, a competitive environment, actually would work if it was done within parameters. Those of the Chicago school, the Milton Friedmans, were just ignorant of the fact that free market and competition is worthwhile as long as it is not allowed to run rampant. As long as it doesn't go beyond certain parameters that allow for smaller scale, but there's something even more important. If those producers of the raw materials and the producers of the finished products working in the processing and manufacturing plants, if they're not paid enough money to be able to buy the products that are produced by that society, to be able to support a given standard of living, then they will not be able to live, and our society will not be able to have economic growth. The idea that free trade and these free trade agreements have created, which allows wealth to be created by means other than raw materials extraction or creation and manufactured and processing those raw materials. Once we create a situation where this magical system, this fantasy of interest is, which by the way, I will lend you $20, but in a week's time you'll pay me back $25. That's creating wealth. All of a sudden I've got an extra $5 and I didn't have to do anything. I didn't produce anything. I didn't grow anything. I didn't manufacture anything. All I have done was simply give you some money and sit back and wait, and you have to give me more. That's fiction. That's magic. It just is disconnected from reality. So once we allow a system that does not provide for those producers and the manufacturers to live a decent life, to get a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, that creates a situation where they cannot maintain production at the very base of the economy. Those raw materials producers, primarily those farmers, once again. And that you can see that ripple effect take place throughout the system. In the 1970s, when the unions were strong and powerful, negotiating for expansion in their wages and benefits and things, I mean, that was really worthwhile to see the standard of living improve for the working class, and to also take some of those enormous profits that were generated at the corporate level, at the managerial level, and share them with the actual workers. I mean, that was not a bad thing, because it's one thing Henry Ford figured out. If you pay your workers well enough, they can actually buy the products that you want, that you're producing. That was one of the wonderful things that saved capitalism by creating regulation during the 1930s and the New Deal. We were able to give the workers enough money that they could be consumers themselves and make economic growth happen through consumption. But at the same time, what we did is we forgot about the beginnings of the economic system, the earlier producers, those agricultural producers. So I've got another stage to my discussion that I want to get to, but to wrap this aspect up, wealth comes from the soil, wealth comes from raw materials, and there's this turn to that money. Growth in the economy, growth in wealth, must depend upon selling either raw materials or the finished processed goods. That's the only way to do it. And the businesses that do manufacture goods and sell them, they can only expand. They can only grow to the extent that they are actually using the money that was made by selling goods at a higher price that it took to produce them. There is a point at which you could consider the labor being exploited because it is paid less than the value that it produced. But I would like to suggest that that's not necessarily a bad system if the workers are being paid enough to the point where they can live a decent life. Like I say, put a little bit aside for when bad things happen. They're not going to go belly up. They're not going to die. They'll be able to take care of themselves. So if we can live a decent life, put a little bit aside to save, and at every stage of the game, people are making enough to live a decent standard of living and take care of themselves and put a little bit aside for savings. The problem was, at the very top of that system, after that money is turned 7 times, those people got a little greedy. They got a lot greedy. And they decided, we could make a lot more money from buying and selling and manipulating markets if we were to destroy the ability of those people at the bottom of the system, those farmers. If we can destroy their ability to make money off of their finished product, if we could sell products at a lower cost than what they can buy, we could make more money from that. And it's not necessarily because now we can squeeze more money out of the system by buying agricultural products from a foreign country where the standard of living is lower, where the cost of living is lower, and therefore the wages are lower and the products cost less, so that you can sell those lower cost products in our economy and you can make money that way. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I was saying, the real money doesn't come from manipulating, producing products and paying lower prices than you end up selling those products for. The real money then would be generated from the debt that's required in order to sustain economic growth. Where do the farmers go then if they're not making enough money to sustain themselves and to purchase the things that they need? They have to borrow the money, and therefore they're starting to get into that cycle of debt by borrowing money, paying back compound interest. Those interest payments are then that magical money, that added value that those at the top, the world traders, those people that are manipulating currencies and manipulating the cost of goods, they're making money off of this debt. The scary thing that we have, after we have now used the free market, deregulate, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand mentality that we need absolutely no regulation of our economic system whatsoever. There has been this mentality. We need to get rid of all regulation. We need to get rid of all interference in the marketplace. That's a brilliant ideology constructed by those people that are going to make money off it, but it wrecks everything else. It wrecks a lot of things. Well, we can get into the meaning of work and the importance of work in people's lives and people's minds. And that's something that Karl Marx, in his simplicity, and by the way, Karl Marx never once interviewed, spoke to, or systematically talked with any workers whatsoever. He did most of his writing in the library or the pub. He was not out there talking with the people. So therefore, he constructed a logical argument that labor itself has been demeaned to the point that it is meaningless, that people don't find any worth, any meaning in their jobs because all the skill has been taken away, that they're doing repetitive, simplistic jobs that have just no skill, no knowledge, no ability to find any reward whatsoever. From my interviewing blue-collar workers, and frankly, I've been one all my life, jobs do have meaning. They have very important connection to people's identities, to their understandings of self, to their understandings of value in life, with society itself. So Marx did come up with some very simplistic ideas that still guide social theory today and all of our understandings of social class and of work and all these essential aspects of our lives. So just the meaning of labor and things that Marx simplistically created, I mean, they make logical sense. And we can see intuitively that once we mechanize production, we do take skill away from it. We have de-skilled labor along the line, but we didn't ever eliminate all meaningful rewards, all intrinsic rewards coming from our labor. So that's one simplistic idea. What we've done, though, is greater than just simply destroy the human individual's spirit and take away their integrity, their connection with their most important role in society, which is the work that they do, the labor that they use to contribute to society. What we've really done is upended our economic system. Our economic system, which at one time was built upon growth from actually producing wealth and then processing and renewing that wealth through human labor to increase more wealth, we now are basing our economy on debt. Not only are the farmers who produce wealth to begin with through their raw material production forced to go into debt in order to maintain their standard of living, in order to expand their production, which they then need because the myth is that they need to continually expand their yield, because if they don't do that, they don't have the economy of scale to compete in the marketplace against heavily subsidized grain, etc. But also then the workers who used to work in manufacturing goods and processing those agricultural materials, which, by the way, most of those manufactured goods had a market because of agriculture. Producing products can be used in the rural areas. It was the rural parts of the country where the farms took place that consumed most of the manufactured goods. And most of those manufacturing industries that we now have are things that at one time were done on the farm. The things that were 200 years ago done independently by each individually owned farm. Most of these farmers were very independent, making their own clothing, their own soap, all their own food, etc., on down the line. Well, even those manufacturers now have lost their jobs because those global traders, that have been pushing for free trade, to find cheaper sources of wealth, and we've moved our manufacturing out of this country as well. Where in the world are we going to make wealth? How do we expand our economy? How do we grow in value in our society if we don't produce any raw materials and we don't manufacture anything? It really is a political economy, and your notion of the ideology, the thinking, the ideas behind this that make sense of it, they all have to be in place in order to allow the system to thrive. And somebody came up with the idea that we don't need to produce wealth. We don't need to manufacture anything, which is where wealth really is expanded. We don't need to produce agricultural goods any longer. We'll just buy them from somebody else, and that is where wealth generation actually begins. Well, let's just consume things. And our whole economy will be built upon us buying stuff that somebody else produced. That means we all have to go into debt. There's over $250 billion in individual credit card debt in this country. We have trillions of dollars in debt on the federal level, not counting the state level. Not counting the local level, the city level. California is bankrupt. Illinois is $15 billion in the hole, and each individual household is in a very similar situation. All built upon the idea that somebody sold us that said, we don't need to produce anything, we'll all be consumers. We'll all just run around and go shopping and buy a bunch of stuff, and we'll all be happy. And I guess we were kind of dumb, and we bought it. So we need to do something about that. Bring our manufactured goods back here. We need to start growing our food back in our country again. But there's another thing too. We can't do it at factory farms, industrial agriculture. We need to do it in small scale production, because that's how you do it naturally. That's how you make food that actually has nutrition, because it comes from the soil. It's not manufactured through artificial means, through toxic pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers. Not only will we actually maybe be healthy, so that this generation isn't going to be the first in human history to die at a younger age than their parents. We could do that to make a more healthy society. But once again, also, make a society that's built around individual entrepreneurs, small-scale entrepreneurs, community, local people who know their employees so that they'll treat them well rather than trying to exploit them and squeeze them to death. Because if we don't have individual farmers and small-scale entrepreneurs, manufacturers and producers, if we don't have small-scale individuals with some self-interest but yet still with some community connections, we're going to do exactly what the Soviet Union did when they collectivized all their farms. They took all those individual farmers that had been the backbone of their society for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they put them on the collective farms, and people did lose some motivation. It didn't work. They destroyed their agriculture, and it drove them into serious, serious debt and problems. And it's funny that the Soviet Union, through their communist economic system, and the United States, through its capitalist economic system, have both destroyed their farmers. They both destroyed their manufacturing base, their working class. It has not been pretty for either of those systems. Something in between the extremes is actually quite important. We need democracy. We need to start taking control of our own society again. Do you remember this is government of the people, for the people, and by the people? This whole we the people thing that we had to memorize in kindergarten. We need to make that work, and then we can then set prices at parity so that we can pay our workers a fair wage. We'll be paying more for our food. We will be paying more for our sneakers and our shirts and our television sets. But at the same time, those workers that are producing those things will keep the money in our economy. We can, pay somebody else to produce our stuff, and then we'll have the stuff, but they'll have our money. If we pay ourselves to produce the stuff, we'll have the stuff and the money. It's simple. So we need to, control prices at parity so people can afford to live a decent life, not get rich, but have enough so that they're not going to die if they have a calamity or a problem. We need to limit the size of our producers, make sure that we cannot allow anybody to become so big that they can control the marketplace, exploit workers, so no one has any other option but to bend at the knee to the great capitalist. We do need to make businesses serve the needs of society. And if they stop doing that, we take away their charter, we throw them in jail, whatever it takes. And small-scale production among private individuals with this understanding of community, of togetherness. And really, it all started by these large manufacturing banking interests wanting to take the American farmer off of parity. And that's what happened in 1950. They were finally able to, oh, by the way, they did it earlier too in the 1920s, which led to the Great Depression. There was not enough money. People were going into debt. Once people are living off of debt, they cannot repay the money, the compound interest, and there simply was not enough money in the economic system. It wasn't just purely speculation on the stock market. It was led up to by the deregulation and the reduction of tariffs, which were protecting the wages of American businesses, so that American economy was supporting the American people. Now, it sounds a little bit selfish to say we're going to wall off our country and make sure that all imports come into this country have to pay a certain price. We are going to sell all of our products at the amount to which the producers of that product will be paid a decent wage. If we were to do that, then the United States prices, because we are such an enormous consuming country, we buy so much stuff, the rest of the world would have to sell their products at our rates. That means these other poor producers that are now slaving away in these sweatshops for pennies on the day, they would have to then, they would be able to sell their products, if they're going to sell them in our market, for our money. That would be a windfall for the workers, for the farmers in other societies, but what would more likely happen is they wouldn't be able to sell in our markets because they couldn't afford, so they'd end up selling to their own market at parity prices. Everyone's wages would come up. That's another thing the global trader, the global industrialist doesn't want to see, is some kind of a global fair price for a fair day's work. So, this whole notion of free trade, which was pushed through not by Ronald Reagan and not by George Herbert Walker Bush, but by Bill Clinton. We could go in all night. I wish we could actually spend more time, but I really wanted to get the fundamental ideas that really motivated this free trade were the manipulation of price. Not just so that we could find lower prices of labor so that we could sell our manufactured goods at an even greater profit margin. We do, by the way, buy our $150 Nike sneakers. It costs less than $5 to actually produce those sneakers. So, I mean, there is a bit of money to be made there, but like I say, the real money to be made is putting all these American workers in debt by being able to manipulate currencies and manipulate economies to be able to make money by trading back and forth between these other countries. We really are missing the picture if that's really what we're looking at, is what labor is being paid. The global traders, the big world bankers, they're making money in many, many ways that we're not being allowed to see. And I do really think that we are thinking of the world according to these extremes, which really distort what's actually going on. And in many ways, then, this Marxian critique, while extremely truthful, extremely important and useful, it really does play into the hands of the capitalists because it distorts what's going on, so we are not quite aware of the real picture. Now, why don't I shut up before I keep going? I'm way past my bedtime.
Actually, a really quick question. Maybe you could explain NAFTA and its implications for, say, Mexico, and just a brief synopsis.
That is such a fiasco, it's just ridiculous. When NAFTA passed in 1992, I don't really know because I haven't checked the statistics, but I think I remember from living through it at the time. I wasn't really old back then, I was in my 20s, but I was kind of aware and observant. Once Bill Clinton was elected, I think it was the second thing he did was push NAFTA through Congress. Reagan wanted to do it, he couldn't because the Democrats, being the party of the people and being concerned about the people, they were not going to allow us to completely destroy our local economies, our national economies, by allowing these cheap manufactured goods from other countries to come in and destroy the wages of American workers. So the Democrats were always resisting the Republican, the pro-business, pro-global trader desire to eliminate tariffs. So Reagan couldn't do it. Bush first tried to do it. And then once Clinton was a Democrat, once he was elected, I think that was the second thing he did after no tell, don't ask, don't tell. But what it did immediately, within 4 years, I'm quite sure that 40 million Mexicans fell into poverty in those 4 years, and the price of food, the price of corn particularly, which is the staple of Mexican economy and culture, dropped by 20%. So we wrecked the Mexican economy, we wrecked the lives of the majority of the Mexican people who lived off of the production of corn, particularly in the southern half of the country. And so now we're all worried about all these illegal immigrants flooding across the border. Well, NAFTA's what did it. NAFTA's what caused it. We wrecked their society, we put their people out of work, we drove them into poverty, and when you're in poverty and you can't feed your children, you'll do whatever you have to. Even if it means making a perilous journey, risking your life, going to live in some foreign country you don't speak the language, where you know you're going to have to live on poverty wages to begin with, but if it's better than what you could make back at home, you'll live without seeing your wife and your children for years at a time, just to send money back down to them to keep them from starving to death. It really is incredible what we, the people of the United States of America, have allowed to happen to Mexico, and then we've allowed those big, huge industrialists, the global traders, the same people, by the way, that own NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox News, CNN, etc., who are telling us, look at all these problems here from these darn immigrants coming into our country. We need to be aware of it and be afraid of it. It's just really insidious. What a distraction. That way we never have to question what caused it all to begin with. We're not just wrecking their society, our wages have declined. Most Americans are living on thousands of dollars less today than we were in the 1970s. We're not only living on thousands of dollars less every year, but we're working many more hours every week in order to just lose money. But yet we're told that we should be happy. Everything is great. We're going shopping all the time. We're further in debt is the only way that we can maintain the standard of living. So through debt, now we know that the system's screwed. We know we're getting more and more debt. So as long as we can keep eating our Prozac, I guess we'll be all right. And we're not all addicted to Prozac. Some of us are just smoking dope and getting drunk every day. It is really a destroyed. Is this on YouTube?
Yes, sir.
So, we have been manipulated. And, I'm concerned at the distraction between these, extreme voices. And part of these global traders have convinced half of our society that we need deregulation. When you can't even breathe the air outside and you start to say, we ought to do something about this smog. I had some of my students earlier today tell me that they mentioned how horrible the air was, and somebody was violently angry at them. How dare you even say that we should have some regulation, some control of our pollution? So we've convinced half the population that, it's wrong, it's sinful, it's ungodly to do anything about regulating the economy, to make sure that businesses don't get too big, that they don't go against the public interest, and they don't screw people out of their deserved and earned wages. So we've got that half, but then we've got the other half that are seeing that as a hostile and violent problem, but the paradigm that we have to critique it is one that only sees the contrary. The Joseph Stalin, not a nice guy, not a good guy. That system didn't work. It's not good, but a system that is compassionate, that is concerned, that does see the interest of the people in being relatively equal, relatively in balance and harmony with what we need to survive and what we can also put away on the side in order to make sure that we're not going to get screwed if things turn bad.
Do you want to do a quick Q&A? I'm sure
I'd be
Greg
happy
has-
to,
Greg
yeah,
has
as
some
long as I'm
questions.
still sleepwalking.
Do you want to? Oh, no.
Oh yeah, and perhaps, do you mind if I gave the first
No, that's fine.
comment to, because I just think you're full of truth. but just not all of it.
I guess I would have to ask that, or this in a follow-up. So do you believe that there is a position that one can have that's completely free of any ideological lens?
Oh, we are human beings, and we're always going to be products of our environment. Therefore, our thinking reflects those experiences, and there's always going to be bias. So there needs to be explanation. And the things that I was describing are ideological. There is no doubt. We'll never have a perfect system. It will always be flawed. We'll always have individuals that seek, to throw a monkey wrench into the system or whatever. We have to try to find something that at least is the best we can do and deal with the problems as they arise. But yeah, I have a hard time thinking. We could have an ideology that explains, well, what an ideology is. Explains and justifies inequality. It explains and justifies the way a social system should work, and if there is inequality, it's made sense of. It's justified, and that's what an ideology does. So we'll always need to have that. We could have a system, though, that explains and justifies the way society ought to be as one which is kind and compassionate, that has community and a sense of concern for our neighbors, and that kind of thing.
So just quick, so would you say that the ideology you're espousing is sort of like capitalism with a human face?
It would be a free market, competitive market between small-scale, local, community-based producers, which I hate to use those words because they are so ideological, but in a way,
okay.
Something in between the extremes. Yeah.
Okay, and this will be my last one. I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist fighting for global revolution and the global abolition of capitalism. But as a matter of fact, don't you think actually your idea is the most utopian ideology, that from the coordinates of a market system, from the coordinates of essentially a capitalist system, that these problems can be mitigated, since the history of capitalism so far at least has shown us, for example, you mentioned monopolies, busting monopolies. The Sherman antitrust law was pretty much exclusively used until a few big cases to bust unions.
Yeah.
So isn't the most utopian ideology today thinking that we can solve any of these problems from the coordinates of capitalism?
Actually, what made the agrarian American system effective was that small-scale ownership, the competition between local producers, when 90% of our country was small yeoman farmers, independent producers, own their own farms, etc. That could never have happened unless we committed genocide on the people that were here. The only way that it would have ever happened was here in North America, where we did destroy everyone there. It would be very difficult to revert back to those days, although I do have that kind of concern and wishes. But yeah, no matter what, we're kind of stuck at this point. What we really need to do is keep from destroying our entire planet. So, but certainly, I would concede that any model we look at is really going to be tragic. But I do fear that, going the extreme, Maoist, Leninist, Marxian ways, we're not without flaws either. No matter which way we do it, we are ending up with an unfortunate circumstance.
Sure.
I would love to talk with you a little later so we can get some other people, because I really love your talk.
Yeah, we can take Rob, and I know Catherine had her hand up. So.
Does that sound really cool?
I have a question basically on opportunity. Your system, your ITEL system, is you place it says there's all these small businesses, all these small entrepreneurs, basically where we all have the chance to become an entrepreneur in our area and really relate to and care about all the other individuals. But the question I have is where the opportunity to do so arises. You clearly are opposed to debt or loans or something.
Oh, yeah.
And so these individuals who start a business, theoretically, the only way I can see is if they already have money and therefore can start a business, thus generating more money, or thus we still see the power inequality. Is there another system of opportunity that you would propose to allow people a somewhat egalitarian opportunity to business?
Perhaps we could do what Bolivia is trying to do right now and chop up these large corporate-owned farms and allow small groups to come in and take them into small parcels of land. But even going and doing that would be pretty big challenge at this point because we've already wrecked the nutrition in our topsoil, so it's going to be kind of hard to actually produce something of value for quite a long time. But going back to some kind of natural progression to try to create those kinds of things would be, at least hope for the future.
I suppose the real question is how?
Yeah. Oh, perhaps we could have a large-scale revolution and take our country back. And maybe we ought to also take into consideration some of the Marxist and Leninist and Stalinist concerns, the Maoist concerns, and couple them with the concerns trying to make best use we can about individual self-interest and desire to improve. The thing about self-interest, we do want to create wealth. We want to pass something on to our next generation. And rather than, pass on, the muscle car in my garage or, the house that I own, maybe it would be productive soil, healthy ecosystems, things that are useful to the next generation will be sustainable over a long period of time. So we definitely have to rearrange our consideration of, what is wealth and what is profit and what is desirable and valuable in our society. We've been co-opted and messed up by these capitalists that have trained us to always look for whatever the cheapest price is. Well, what about quality? What about use? Things that are valuable that we can actually take in our lives that will make our lives better. And perhaps we should start thinking about value being with interpersonal relationships and community rather than the objects that we can wear, own, use, or whatever. So there's some distortions in our thinking that would have to be resolved, there's no doubt. Everything upon which we define value needs to be reconsidered.
Did you have your questions?
Well, the easier one first, but what book would you recommend reading as far as recalling like return to local economies or local movements? And you mentioned Unforgiven, is that what you were referring to?
Well, certainly Charles Walters captures this raw materials economics. The National Organization for Raw Materials, or NORM, the acronym NORM, NORM Economics has a website. You can look that up. I will be offering a class if we want to look more into detail with not just the economic realm, but in terms of democracy and human freedom and those kinds of things, going back to an earlier agrarian value system. I'll be doing that in the first block of the summer. But Wendell Berry's Unsettling of America would be the first thing on my list no matter what.
Okay. And then secondly, I'm familiar with what's occurred is for farmers and with the situation going back to what you're talking about, going into that over raw materials. For example, once seeds were free, they become patented by Chinese by Monsanto.
We'd have to kill Monsanto.
So I'm familiar with, the mass amounts of suicides that have occurred in other countries because of this, and unfortunately, I should know about this in the States, and I'm ignorant that this has occurred historically in the United States because when the farmers going into that over raw material occurred.
I personally have known farmers that have killed themselves.
Is there a time? So
that's just anecdotal. But
over time period, is there a specific? Would it be like back in the 50s when this took hold here that you referred to? Did we see the same occurrence of high amounts of suicide?
I don't know those numbers, so I can't really comment. I can only speak to my anecdotal evidence. Since the late 1950s, when the parity price was abandoned, which we established during the 1920s and maintained through 1950, when those were abandoned, that's when we started to see large-scale farm foreclosures, and that continued to slide for a long time, but it was exacerbated in 1982 as we continued to import more of the agricultural products, which drove the price down even further, and then we've had another recent round in the mid-1990s of another precipice that the agricultural community fell off. And agriculture in our society being the base of wealth in our society, it really is the bellwether for our entire economy.
And real quickly, so subsidies that are given to farmers, can I generalize that that's usually given to elite few or like
Yes.
social favoritism?
Of over the $10 billion that we signed into law with this farm bill last time, over 75% of it goes to agribusiness. There are some multi-millionaire farmers in there too. Yeah, it does not go to the small-scale farmers. In fact, the small-scale farmers are pushed all the time to expand production, to grow their operations, and the only way to do that is to go into debt further. As you bring more cows on if you're a dairy, or if you expand the fields, or you start producing more acreage, then you need more tractors, you need faster equipment to do it quickly, you need more equipment. All the things that you need to do then puts you further into debt, which is only good for those manufacturers that are selling all the new implements and hardware. It's not helping the small farmer, and eventually they become so far in debt that they lose their farm, and once again it goes to Archer Daniels Midland. We can go on down the line, Cargill, blah blah blah.
Jacob, and then I have a question too.
Far out.
Yeah, I mean,
This is a great group. I'm really glad you all are here.
it seems to me like this notion of like the small independent farmer who is not exploiting other people around him is this sort of weird mythic this sort of presentation that a lot of people have on the left. Oh, if we just got rid of all the Walmarts, then everybody would treat each other fair. If you've been around the world, and I suspect you have been a few times.
I've been all the way around North America.
Okay. Well, I suspect that you probably know that some of the biggest exploiters of people around the world are small people, people that know each other personally, specifically people in families. This Doll's Capital, which you've claimed to have read, speaks at length
I
about
never did claim to have read that, but I did read it many times.
Okay, very good. Good. So, like, the handicraft industry is a really good example of this, where people constantly put their children to work. And I've actually been places in the world now. For instance, I went to India. I went through the slums where, a friend made me go. But
Horny.
what?
No.
Anyway, the point is I don't see how going to these smaller businesses are going to basically deflect all the evils of capitalism you claim it will. And in fact, I think historically, we have all the evidence in the world to believe that it will, in fact, continue to exploit people, whether or not it is on a large scale where it's more effective, or on the shorter scale, well, it just can't be as effective because they don't have that sort of specific sort of implementation. So I don't know how you think you're going to make the world better by making smaller corporations into bigger corporations into smaller corporations, essentially.
Well, I do want to say that directly began this conversation to try to understand the desire to make a global economy, to create a situation where we can undermine producers, the cost of, or the wages paid in our economy, to go away from a system where we depend upon the wages that we earn from our own work by producing goods or raw materials and being paid a parity price, one that is fair and adequate to live a decent living. If all those people along the line were able to produce goods, services at a parity price so they could live a decent life, if the wage was acceptable, and it wouldn't necessarily even be a national standard because every region has different standards of living and different costs of living, so we'd have to have a local or regional control over what the price of goods would be, what the price that workers would earn, as well as controlling the size, the scale of production. Just even envisioning that we are going to have small corporations. I mean, the ideology, that the values, the language, the concepts, this framework of concepts that we use to understand things are still getting in the way if we think, well, maybe we just had small corporations. A corporation may be necessary if it's in the public interest to pool our money. We could do it publicly or we could do it through a private business, but if it was small scale and if it was meant to always be in the best interest, a service for society, then at least we would have a vehicle where we could remove that charter if it got out of hand. We need to have local control regardless of what that is. And there will always be flaws. You know, we see in other indigenous cultures that don't have, you know, market economies, we see big men, strong individuals that control resources. It's going to be a challenge to do that. Perhaps democratically, we could do that on a local scale. I don't really have the optimism. I lost my utopian dreams a number of years ago. And to be honest, I had more utopian dreams till I came here to Utah. I love the community. I love the sense of common identity and common concern for our neighbors, but at the same time, you lose individuality. The pressures that must be put on the individual to conform are enormous if you're going to have people all contributing to a common pot when not all people are able to contribute to the same level. It's a frustrating dilemma. I don't know if you can have a utopian society, but at least we can try to create checks and balances to maintain some kind of an equitable distribution of wealth, standard of living, and those kinds of things. As far as, you know, people exploiting their children by putting them to work, which is what they did on farms. I mean, you know.
These idealized forms you're speaking about.
Oh yeah, we are also.
That didn't have slaves.
Is it better now that we're not putting our children to work, sitting them in front of the TV and the video games, and wasting them away on Twinkies or McDonald's or whatever it is? We're really not doing much good for our kids by not making them work either. We have to work. Work is a part of life. Somebody convinced us that, you know, we should avoid work and we should avoid pain. You need pain. You need work.
People make that same argument about why kids should sew together soccer balls in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So the question is, what type of labor they're doing is whose benefit is that?
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, some people are rather narrow-minded. Some people don't think that their kids would benefit by things like an education. And with all this local cult control you seem to be giving to everyone, it seems
I didn't
like,
use that word cult either.
No, I'm sorry. I meant control.
Okay.
I have a speech impediment. I'm sorry. But anyway, yeah, these local control entities, you know, I could envision large parts of the United States just wouldn't send their kids to school. Why do you need to write, Mark? Read and write, you know?
I was listening to Jared Rubin and Abby Hoffman. They said, tune in, turn on, and drop out. Maybe we don't need to be in school. You know, that's the problem. We ship all of our manufacturing and all of our agriculture over to other countries, and now we have to go to college in order to get a white-collar job that's not going to produce anything. That's a parasitic occupation. And, you know, we do want some people to go to college. We want everybody to go to college, to be educated at least. But in order to do it, in order to get a job, is destructive to our society because we don't have the distribution of resources that's going to prepare everybody to go to college. We don't have the ability for people to go to college, to put the time and the energy into it because they're too busy working, they're too busy distracted with their family and other responsibilities. There is an elite privilege to go to college, and I don't want it to be for the rich, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to limit it to a certain number of people either. In fact, going to college would be good, but this demand that you do it in a certain amount of time in order to get out there into the workforce is kind of a problem as well. If we did it, you know, so that everybody needed to be educated, but could it be done on a part-time basis, and it could be done because we want to be enriched, because we want to be aware citizens. That would be a different thing than having to do it for an occupation. A white-collar occupation is bogus. It's a parasite. It doesn't produce anything. It's valuable and necessary, but not in the numbers that we seem to be promoting. We need people to do the work. We can't do without it.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, comment type thing, and then I'll give you the last word, and then we can wrap it up.
Boy, is it hard for me to stop, so.
It is. Maybe
just throw something at me. That would be it.
Well, okay, so you seem to level some accusations at my buddy Stalin. That's a joke, but okay. So I think this is very important. If you fail to situate the Soviet Union in its historical and material conditions, you lose the valuable frame of reference to judge what Stalin did, what Lenin did. Right? And it's worth noting there hasn't been a single communist country or leftist country, whether it is the Soviet Union or whether it is Allende's Chile, who gets democratically elected and, you know, it's ostensibly a bloodless revolution, that hasn't come under intense scrutiny as well as existential threat from, let's say, imperialist America.
That is accurate.
And so, now, this leads me to my point. Given the fact that during, right, we'll just take Stalin. Collectivization, right, you mentioned this, you send these people on collectivized farms. The Ukraine is traditionally the breadbasket of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Right, that's where they get all their grain from. And at a point, right, actually this is more towards Lenin, what happened was the Ukrainian peasants, ostensibly, started withholding grain from the cities. And they were essentially starving out the cities. And what follows from this is Lenin says, oh no you don't, and collectivizes the farm, sends in the troops. So my two questions are the following. Actually, I guess this is one question that leads me back to my original one. Given the fact that ostensibly you could set up some sort of your utopian, right, small capitalist-run farms, how do you intend to defend that? One, and I guess I'll just leave it at that. So.
Defend it from
well, I'm just saying,
others that want to conquer us to take over.
Right. Say we set up a commune like something like some of this in Moab, right? They're pretty on top of their stuff. If I'm well read on that, they decide to kind of just drop out of the economy, stop paying state taxes, and just want to do their own thing. And let's just say Salt Lake City says no.
Perhaps people shouldn't be living in places that don't have topsoil and don't have water, that don't have raw materials with which you can live upon. You know, I don't think we should have a Las Vegas out there sucking up all of our water and things like that. So I don't know if Moab would be the place.
Okay.
I do agree that our critique of communism, of socialism, of things that are contrary to capitalism, have never been allowed to be done with an equal playing field. We have no idea what could have happened. In fact, when you do collectivize, when you work together, it is so much more efficient. That's why we went to a centrally planned system during World War II. Every country that has ever pooled their resources has been able to, produce things on an enormous scale, much more efficiently than a free market enterprise where people are dispersed and working in self-interest. That is how the Mormons came to Utah and made the desert bloom. There's no way the society here would be so developed if people weren't working together. People were working together to such an extent that it was actually seen as a huge threat to others, and that's part of the reason that Mormons have been unpopular in so many different places, because it is so darn efficient. It is a wonderful system, and we ought to work together. We do need to work together. And somehow, if we're going to have people individually producing things in a local, small-scale economy, it can't be one in which we are putting our desire for profit above others. We cannot exploit others in order to become wealthy. That is a skewed system. It is a flawed system. So we need somewhat of a hybrid so that people still have a chance to actually have their work meaningful. We can produce goods and services and be proud of our labor, get paid a decent wage, but at the same time, not at the expense of our neighbors in our community.
Absolutely. And I promise you the last word, and so I'll leave it at that.
And I wish I'd have done it a long time ago. For many reasons, but I wish we could just stay here all night.
Very good. Well, I'd love to give Dr. Jeff Torlina a hand for his effort.